Unit 8. We are now going to discuss the allophone patterns of the phonemes of English. In the last unit, we looked at the phonemes. But as I've mentioned before, each phoneme has usually a group of allophones that are variations of the pronunciation of that phoneme in different contexts. Now, native speakers are not aware of these variations, and so they are not represented in spelling, usually for that reason. If it would be possible to list all of the common allophones of each phoneme consonant of English, but this will be a large amount of detail and very difficult to remember. Instead, we are going to give you a smaller list of some common patterns, which you will be able to use to, let's say, point the students in the right direction. Now, you could memorize these patterns, and if you did, you'd have a hold of a lot of the significant allophones of American English. And these are mainly derived from the work of Dr. Peter Allophone, one of the most brilliant phoneticians in the world. And if you do want to do more with this topic, please see Dr. Allophone's book, A Course in Phonetics. Now, let's go into some detail. Okay, so we're going to start with consonant allophones, and there are 12 different patterns that I'm going to go over. And they, again, represent all these little variations in English that native speakers aren't aware of, and that sometimes a non-native speaker is, without doing a lot of them, that's how you get a foreign accent. In other words, foreign accents typically don't come from consonants by themselves. Consonants by themselves are relatively clear, but it's all of the allophones of the consonants, when you don't do them correctly, that signal that you're a non-native speaker. So if you are trying to have a very natural and native speaker-like pronunciation, these are the sounds you would pay attention to. So let me start with aspiration. And you remember, aspiration is that little pause after a voiceless stop before the voicing begins. And it's one of the primary signals for the voiceless stops in English. Some languages don't make a distinction between voiced and voiceless stops by using aspiration. English does. And they also use aspiration, as I said, to signal voicing, but sometimes they are still voiceless but unaspirated. And that occurs at the ends of words in English. So that top is not aspirated typically, like the top of the desk. The top, it just ends on the P, which is another variation or allophone. Now let's talk about length. And as I said in the earlier module, length is a primary device for signaling voiced versus voiceless. So voiceless stops and affricates are longer at the end of a syllable, whereas the voice stops and affricates are shorter at the end of a syllable. Remember, this patterns with the vowels, so that one is longer, one is shorter. And that's another signal for voicing in the stops and affricates of English. Now let's talk about release and unrelease. Release means you open the stop. Obviously, when you stop the sound, the air coming out, you've stopped it. And normally you release it. You let the air then continue after the stop. But there are times in English when we don't release the stop. And I just gave you an example. The top of the desk, if that top is at the end of the sentence, let's look at the top. Top, I kept the P and I didn't release it. And what happens is, that's interesting, is when stops come together in a word in English, what happens is you stop on one and release on the other. So it's quite a hybrid sound. It's the length tends to signal which consonant you have, but the actual articulation is stop on one, release on the other. Again, native speakers don't realize it. It's an allophonic practice in English. Okay, let's talk about the glottal stop. The glottal stop is the most extreme different allophone in English. It's an allophone of T. Now, T is an alveolar voiceless stop. Now, how did a glottal stop, which is produced clear down here in the throat, how did that become a T? Well, like all languages, there are little sub-patterns that happen, and we don't always know why, but it's an interesting case of a very different allophone for a sound in English. And you hear it when it comes before an alveolar nasal in the same word, like cotton. So cotton, and by the way, most British dialects don't do this. Well, some do and some don't. Cockney does it. The more prestigious dialects in England don't. But we do it to some extent in American English. So butler, cotton are examples of that pronunciation where we have a glottal stop. Notice I said glottal stop. I put the glottal stop in the word glottal. We also have it in words like wait till I get there, which is an expression where we are in quick speech reducing the words and a glottal stop will appear. Now let's talk about nasals and approximates when they become syllabic. We said before that syllables are one of the basic attributes of language, and we talked about the fact that vowels are the heart of syllables. Vowels can stand on their own. Vowels carry a lot of weight. As a matter of fact, the vowels carry the consonants, and consonants typically cannot be a syllable by themselves. They always have to hang on to a vowel. But there are a few exceptions to that pattern. One is that nasals can become syllabic at the end of a word right after an obstruent. So in the word button, which I just mentioned, or cotton, the obstruent there is the glottal stop, which was a T or is a T psychologically. And then the N is all by itself there at the end. And because an N has voicing, in this particular case, it's able to stand alone by itself after that obstruent. Or sudden, sudden. Notice that you stop on the D and release on the N, so to speak. Sudden. So there are two syllables, sudden. Okay, that's an example of how these patterns can come together in one word to create quite a difference from the spelling. Instead of saying sudden, we don't say that. We say sudden. All right, let me keep going. The same pattern of syllabic consonant occurs in the cases of L and R. And remember, I said they are, as obstruents, they are very vowel-like. And the fact that they are vowel-like helps them to do this process of becoming syllabic, typically at the ends of words. So if they follow a consonant at the end of a word, and again, I'll use the glottal stop to reinforce that concept, bottle, or excuse me, take a word and think of a word that has a consonant at the end followed by an L, as in label, label, bull. And there the silent E, never mind. Now let me go back and say that again. This pattern of nasals and approximants at the ends of words becoming syllabic is quite frequent as long as there's this consonant before it. Now let's talk about taps. Tap, or sometimes the name flap is used, and flap is kind of nice because it indicates that the tongue just quickly flaps up at the top of the mouth and comes back down. So it's not a stop because the air is not stopped. It's, you might call it a mini stop or a very brief interruption of airflow. And so it's very different perceptibly from a regular stop. And English uses it as an allophone of T or D when they occur between two vowels. And that's why the words writer and writer are writer. They're pronounced the same because the T and the D both become this tap or flap between vowels in English. Alveolar consonants typically become dental before dental consonants. Velar stops when they are after a front vowel. So like T, teak, that K will move forward in the mouth. This is a function of the fact that when you're producing a consonant and a vowel together, the brain will let the vowel influence the consonant. So teak, that k is a more palatal K. A small variation again, but many of these are small. It's the combination of all of them that tends to make English more complicated and more full of details that help make the difference between a native speaker and a non-native speaker. Finally, we have the alveolar L, and it's an interesting consonant because we have two varieties in English. When it's before a vowel, it's light. By that I mean it has the L up at the alveolar ridge and the lowering of the side of the tongue. But when it comes after a vowel, there is a velar articulation added to the L. So leak, leak, and kill, kill. So leak and keel. So that's a nice example because you have the same consonants reversed. So leak and keel. Oh, notice how dark that L is in sound. Sometimes these are called light and dark L for that reason. All right, let's move to an example of this process that I've been talking about. A chart that shows us some of the allophones of T. Again, an allophone is a phonetic variant of a phoneme. So it's just one among other sounds that come together to form the phoneme T. And native speakers, they don't hear them, but they do it. So aspiration, I talked about at the beginnings of words. Unaspirated after S, for example, step, or that T is not aspirated, or at the end of a word, top or top. Then there's the flap or tap that I mentioned before, which occurs as an allophone of T between vowels. And this gives us examples of that. Aspirated T at the beginning of a word or a stressed syllable. Tick. Unaspirated after S. Stick. The flap, stressed vowel. So tick, stick, bitter, bitter. And notice butter. Hear the flap there, bitter. Not bitter, bitter, but bitter. And notice that one who bids is a bitter, whereas a bit is different from a bid, but bitter, bitter, they're the same. Let's move on. Let's look at vowels. I'm only going to give a few patterns of allophones and vowels. There are many patterns, but as I said before, we cannot deal with all of them. I'm trying to establish the concept of allophone and give enough examples that you become aware of it. Only if you want to become, only if you want to sound like a native speaker, do you really need to pay that much attention to allophones. But they are real, they're there. Vowels. In the chapter on vowels, or on length regularly, it was a module that dealt with length itself. I made the pattern that length is one of those I made the comment that length is one of those sub patterns that helps signal what a sound is or what the sound is. Vowels are longest in open syllables, next longest in a syllable closed by a voice consonant, and shortest in a syllable closed by a voiceless consonant. That's that same pattern receiving itself. The length of the vowel will depend upon the consonant which follows, just as we saw that the length of the consonant depended upon the vowel in front of it. Was it long or short? Vowels are always longer in stressed syllables. I mean, that's just a fact of English. In the module that discussed stress, we pointed out that stressed vowels are always longer. Now, on the other hand, we talked about the fact that when a vowel does not have stress, and the more unstressed it is, the more it becomes reduced. And by that term, we mean it moves towards schwa. If it's a not very unstressed syllable, it maybe goes halfway towards schwa. So the normal vowel would move in the direction of schwa in the middle of the mouth. But if it's an extremely unstressed schwa, pardon me, if it's a completely unstressed vowel, we would tend to move all the way to schwa. And then if this very reduced schwa occurs before or after a voiceless stop, it can even become voiceless and virtually disappear, as in potato, potato. But since the stress is on the second syllable, potato, we really put potato, and the schwa, which is technically there, becomes voiceless, and the sound just basically disappears. Again, an allophonic pattern, not crucial, but very typical of English. Another length pattern, to go back to the first item on the chart, length varies depending upon the length of the word. The length of a vowel depends upon the length of the word. So if you have a one-syllable word, the vowel is reasonably long because it's stressed, it's all by itself, it's able to take up a lot of the room in that syllable. But now if we have a two-syllable word, one of the syllables is stressed and the other one is not, and both of them are a little shorter than one syllable. And then if you have three syllables, each vowel gets a little less room. So that English has this very clear pattern of, as words become longer, each syllable becomes a little shorter. It's like yes, the word gets longer, but the syllables don't have as much room. They're squeezed together. And that squeezing together in quick speech means we get rid of a lot of consonants or even vowels, as I just said with potato. Let's look at another allophonic pattern of vowels. This is nasalization. When a vowel occurs before a nasal in a word, there's a habit in English of letting that vowel become nasalized, meaning we anticipate the nasal and lower the velum, letting the air go through the nose during the vowel. And I will give you an example of that shortly. Then there's another example of vowels moving in the mouth. And this is when you have the dark L that we just talked about, a vowel will shift back towards that dark L. So we have call, call, but caught, call, caught, call, caught. Too many t sounds there. Okay, so in any case, the vowel tends to move because of the L. There's a lot of this movement back and forth, as I've shown, depending on what consonant or vowel occurs where. Let me give you an example of vowel nasalization next to illustrate this a little bit further. We have B, bead, and notice that we have a difference in the length of the vowel because of the difference in syllable, open syllable, closed syllable. And then we have bean, closed syllable, but there's an N there. And hence bean, I'm trying to emphasize the vowel with its nasalization. Bean. Let's take another example. Lay, lace, and lame, lame, lame. If you pronounce that without nasalizing it, it would sound strange, but it would not change the meanings of the words. Let's go back to bean. Bean, 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 not nasalized. Sounds a little different, but it's still bean. The last example, ba, as in ba, black sheep, black sheep. Bad, bad, bang, bang, bang. Okay, because nasalized vowels are not used to make a meaning contrast, we tend to not even notice them. Again, typical of allophones not being noticed. These are references for some of the concepts mentioned in the module. And that concludes Module 8.